Good morning. My name is Richard Wexler, and I want to welcome you to our podcast, Caring in America. This is episode 19, and on this episode, like we've been doing, we're about to tell a story, a personal story. I want to introduce the young lady that's going to tell you about what happened with her dad and how this affected her family as well. Her name is Wendy Frank. She and her family moved from California to Idaho in 2018. When they first got here, they were actually a law enforcement family, and now they own a landscape business. So, with that said, I want to welcome Wendy. Are you there?
I am. Thanks, Richard, for having me on the show today.
You're very welcome, and I thank you for sharing a difficult subject. I find this kind of interesting. When I read your note, all these issues started in my life in the summer of '05. First with three phone calls. I didn't even give the recap. Three phone calls that turned into four phone calls that turned into my wife and our two small children managing the care of all four of our parents for 14 years, which led to our company Points of Life, which led to this podcast. And again, those phone calls started in the summer of '05. And from what I read about you, this incident with your dad started in December of '05 as well. Go ahead, go ahead and kind of tell our audience what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So on December 19th of 2005, like you had mentioned, was just a typical Southern California, beautiful weather, nice and cool, decorating the Christmas tree. You're only days away from celebrating Christmas. And my mom and I and my dad are just sitting around, hanging out, decorating this beautiful 12-foot Christmas tree. And, there's a lot of stuff going on around the holidays. And my dad said, I'm going to go run down to the neighbor's house real quick. And, they have some gifts and stuff for us. Typically, the neighbors do a little gift bag around the holidays for the neighbors and stuff. And so he said he was going to be right back. And little did I know that his being right back would result in a phone call from the local fire department. My dad's name was Nano, and when anybody knew him, they knew how to pronounce his name. So when you receive a phone call from somebody and they're saying Nano or no, and you're like instantly, you're like, oh my gosh, this person doesn't know my dad. Like, why are they calling me? And so the fire department, the gentleman on the other end of the phone said to me, he's like, your dad's been in some type of accident with his quad. He's being rushed to Riverside General Hospital, which is the critical care unit that was the closest in my area, which would be in technically in Moreno Valley, California, is where that hospital was located. Immediately jumping in the car, trying to gather your thoughts and just not knowing what situation you're walking into. You quickly arrive to the hospital and, they're telling you can't see my dad. And they're just like, we're not sure. We don't know what's happening. We don't know if he's going to live. We're not sure. And still to this day, we don't know exactly what happened with the accident in itself. We don't know if he was hit by a car on his quad. Unfortunately, he did not have a helmet on, so he did suffer traumatic brain injury, broken ribs, broken collarbone. They shared that, shortly after he was evaluated. So they put him in a medically induced coma for 30 days. And for me, as a 23-year-old who was recently 23, still trying to figure out what my plan was, I had just finished college and was working in retail and high-end retail in Orange County. And at that moment, I was just, you can't even think about any of that stuff because that's not the main priority. You're just, is my dad going to live? I want to be by his side. And you just kind of like everything else goes out the window. And so for me, it was just those long nights in the hospital, not knowing whether or not what the outcome was really going to be. And then you quickly realize like you're navigating the hospital and making sure, he's getting the right care, the right medication, the right patient. So that's kind of how this journey began for me as a young 23-year-old navigating, and what's to come with caring for my dad, they considered him elderly. He was in his I think he was in his 60s at the time of the accident. So, that was always being like, what is a 60-year-old man doing on a quad? And when you live in no man's land per se and have property and your neighbors are quite a ways away, that's just like the normal way of living. So that's how I became unfortunately, very knowledgeable of navigating the healthcare system, and then also like how you can be prepared for what's to come when you have your parents that are aging, or if you have other medical issues or an accident, like in my case, that changes the direction of your life.
Let me ask you a couple questions. First of all, for people that don't know what a quad is, can you kind of paint a picture of what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So a quad it's 4 wheels. And so it's kind of like the easiest way to describe it would be like a dirt bike, but only with 4 wheels. So it's still like a lot of people use them for hunting. And that's the main reason why my dad had one. He used it for hunting. So they're an off-road vehicle.
Is that something he rode quite a bit?
Yeah, this wasn't abnormal for him to use it on a daily basis. So I would say, he was very skilled and knowledgeable of riding this piece of equipment.
But unfortunately, on this given day, he chose not to wear a helmet.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So kind of what I try to get from these stories that we're talking about, whatever lessons we can learn, and for our audience, obviously, whether it's a 5-year-old child riding their bike or a 60-year-old man riding a quad, that's something that we want to think about. And I mean, when this happened to me, I was in my early 50s. So I was in a different place in my life, married with 2 small kids, compared to you at 23. And then we talk about it, and as we share these stories, it can be a fall, it can be an illness, it can be a combination thereof, or like you're talking about, it can simply be an accident that all of a sudden happens, and as you've said, changes your life. How long was your dad in the hospital?
Oh my gosh. I would say it was probably a good 6 months, because he was on a respirator in, a medically induced coma for 30 days. And then from there, they have to slowly wean you off of the ventilator. So that took some process. And then also, too, when you're coming out of a coma and you're dealing with traumatic brain injury, there's a lot of other things that go into working through, like your motor skills have to be rebuilt. Your strength has to be rebuilt. And so there was a lot of stuff that had to go back into rehab. Swallowing, I didn't personally, as a 23-year-old, had never really dealt with anybody in the hospital or have experience with anybody that had been on a respirator or anything like that. So like there's a swallow test and a chew test to make sure you don't aspirate. So there's a lot of things that go into a rehab after a brain injury and then being in a medically induced coma, not to mention the other injuries that came along with the accident. So it was a good 6 months, I would say, with that. And then he went into a skilled nursing home, which is where they would send you after the hospital, and then that's where all your therapy comes in, and they work on the fine motor skills. So yeah, it was a good 6 months, I would say. But you know, unfortunately, it's not a one and done. It's not that you have an injury and then you recover and then you can just go back to normal living. So I mean, this was a long 7-year drawn out process until unfortunately my dad did pass.
Wow. When did he pass? What year?
Um, I'd have to do the math.
That that that's
I know.
okay. So about around 2012, it sounds like 7 years. Is that
Yeah, I was gonna say it's actually because he passed before I found out I was pregnant with my oldest, which would have been in 2012.
so? We've taped a young lady. It hasn't gone live yet. It may go live in the next day or so, and she's actually a patient advocate because I have to believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and you've kind of said this, you're now in a hospital setting, you're dealing with the injury that your father had, you're trying to figure out how you manage his care, how you manage the hospital, and then beyond that, how you manage after the hospital skilled nursing. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's hard is to I really truly believe that, if the outcome probably would have been different for us, because I feel like these facilities, they are doing the best they can. And I truly believe that with the amount of resources they have. But, as we know, is the medical staff is always kind of scarce. People call in sick, people don't show up. There's only a certain people that can actually do pathology, that can work with the swallow test after the respirator. And so for me and my mom, it was really important for one of us to always be there, because there was multiple times where my dad's food would show up and there wasn't a nurse available to sit with him to make sure he didn't aspirate. And so for us, it was super important for us, and I believe to the care, for us to be present as much as possible. And for a 23-year-old, that isn't how I expected to live my 20s. But again, just when you're in a nursing home or skilled nursing, like there's the falling incident, getting out of bed, even though they have an alarm on you, making sure for me, it was my dad, making sure he's going to go to the bathroom. If he doesn't go to make it to the bathroom in time, an accident, like how long is he going to sit there waiting to be changed? Where for us, we would just take care of it, or we were able to just have a nurse come in and let them know, here's the situation. And again, it is very, I would say, depending on where you're at, the staffing might be different. But in my experience with 4 different facilities, it was very crucial to the recovery of my dad that my mom and I were present.
Wow. So, what kind of conversations are you having with your mom through these first so many weeks and months?
It's kind of a blur, to be honest with you, because I feel like there was so many long days where you're just kind of on this autopilot, and you almost don't want to look to what the future holds, because then you'd be acknowledging that he might not get better. He might not be the way he was before this incident. And so that is a hard reality for a lot of people. And as for myself and for my mom, like, it just wasn't something that we wanted to necessarily talk about. Is kind of that elephant in the room where I think me and my mom were on the same page, but we just didn't really want to have that conversation. We just kind of kept going, and then made sure that, we're like, okay, we're going to go out to dinner and we're just going to kind of relax and just kind of regroup. Or we'd go home for a period of time just to have time together and just kind of clear our head. And just, we paid for caregivers out of pocket to sit with my dad in the hospital as well, just to kind of give us that break.
Wow. So, let's kind of go through this process. He's in the hospital. He goes to skilled. What happens to him after that?
So after skilled nursing, they think that he's well enough to go home. Um, Interesting enough, he was physically capable of doing a lot of stuff on his own, but because of the brain injury, there was a lot of missing pockets for him. Like his communication wasn't great. So here you have, my dad was 6'1", this tall, well built. He was able to recover a lot of his muscle from after the accident through rehab. And so here you have this bigger man than me. I'm only 5'1", and my mom is the same height as well. So we have this, man that's bigger than us, and he could become confused at times and then not remembering who we are or where he lives. And so that became challenging very quickly because, again, we're trying to navigate with someone with a brain injury and convince them that they do live at this house and that I'm his daughter and that my mom is his wife. And he would sit down for dinner sometimes and then just get up and say, "Thanks for the meal. I'm going to go home now," and would just take off walking down the street. So as much as we wanted to care for my dad at home, which we did at different times, we did have a caregiver come in and just kind of help us navigate because, again, my dad couldn't be left alone because we didn't know what he was going to do. And then my dad being an avid hunter, that was another thing that we had to make sure that there wasn't anything in the house, any weapons, any guns from hunting, anything like that around. So, you don't realize the precautionary things that measures you have to go to with somebody that you're not quite sure how they're going to be each day during the recovery.
Wow, this is an unbelievable learning experience for you and your mom. And again, not something you thought you'd be going through in your 20s. Wow. If I can, and if you don't want to talk about this, I totally get it. But if I can ask you a question, how this was financially, what you guys were able to do, what that may have caused within the family unit.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a 23-year-old, navigating my own personal finances, having not sure exactly what career path I was going to take, but being new out of college, working in high-end retail, I had bills. I had a car payment. I had insurance. I had a student loan payment. So for me, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do financially. For me, I was looking for home like jobs that you can do at home. I was introduced to network marketing. So for me, I could work a couple hours during the day and generate income from home, while I was hanging out with my dad, providing food, making sure the caregiver was taking proper care of him. And for my mom, my parents had both worked for Southern California Edison and had retired. I think both my parents were in their late 40s, early 50s, so they were able to do an early retirement. So financially, my parents had done well for themselves. They had owned a lot of real estate, vacant land in various places. So for my parents, the way that this financially, I don't want to use the word devastate because my mom, was able to still live with some of her pension, but my mom had to sell pretty much everything. We went from living on property to a house, a fairly large house, to needing to downsize to pay for the ongoing expenses for a caregiver. So at the time, I believe it was around $10,000, and then depending on if my dad just got out of the hospital, because shortly after he started having seizures, so then his health declined as far as not being mobile. It required a different type of caregiver that needed to be able to lift him. Sometimes you needed two different caregivers, and then you went from 12-hour shifts to 24-hour shifts. So sometimes it would be $10,000 a month to $12,000 a month. And so my mom just slowly started selling off property and houses to be able to pay for their caregivers. Um, you know, and thankfully my parents, you know, had that financial knowledge to set themselves up well, I would say. But this isn't like, you know, my mom and we'd sit around and, you know, my dad would understand certain things, and, you know, you could talk to him, but he couldn't necessarily communicate all the way. But, you know, we'd sit around going, this isn't exactly how you expected to spend your retirement or the money that you worked hard for in your investments. So that's kind of what had happened to my mom with her situation. And then for me, I stayed doing network marketing for quite some time, until, you know, for a couple of years. So I was able to be there with my dad, which I'm so grateful for the opportunity, because, you know, never regret spending more time with him. Even though it was definitely challenging for sure. So please don't misunderstand that. And so then I just, you know, so slowly started to have to pay stuff off, and, you know, not have a fancy car with a large car payment, just had to, you know, have a less expensive car and stuff like that. And so for me, as much as I wanted to physically go to work and, you know, be in the workforce and pursue my career, which I wasn't sure at the time was going to be, it just really changed my perspective on making money outside the home to knowing where my priorities lie, where was knowing that I needed to be home with my dad, helping, and then also generating income in another maybe non-conventional way. So it definitely was financially straining for sure, and very stressful at times for myself.
Wow. Wendy, I thank you for sharing all that, and I know it wasn't easy. And for our listeners out there, I want to do an assimilation. You know, we talk about dementia, we talk about Alzheimer's, and there's all sorts of different types of dementia. And we probably haven't talked that much, if at all, until today about traumatic brain injury. But you wind up in a situation, and I know, and I talk about this all the time, and that's planning, and the word plan that people don't like, and so on and so forth. And it's really challenging to plan for an accident like Wendy's family went through. But again, she's talking about some of those costs, which are not different from cost for a lengthy illness and care, or dementia, or Alzheimer's. And folks, we try to really, as we talk about these stories, try to really help people understand this is what it's going to be for a lot of people. I'm not saying an injury like this, and I'm not saying a traumatic brain injury, but as things start happening as we age, there's so many pieces that go around that. As we've talked a lot about, it's all the emotional, it's the physical, trying to lift your father, lift your mother, whomever it may be, and it's the financial. So if we get any message across from these stories that you're listening to, really think about where you are in your own life, where your older loved ones are, and that what if? What if something happens? So, as we kind of wrap up, Wendy, I mean, I'm sure you think about this a lot. We think about what we went through. Are there any lessons you really learned throughout this whole situation with your dad?
Well, I think you can never really be prepared emotionally, but if you have the opportunity to set yourself up financially and have someone like yourself that's advocating for, planning accordingly, then I think that all that stuff is kind of to the sidelines, and you can just be there and process emotionally, because I feel like we make really bad, poor decisions, lack of sleep, and we're running on adrenaline and emotion. So for me, when you had shared your podcast, I personally know there's a huge need for it. And there's so many different avenues that a lot of people don't know about, a lot of resources. And I think my mom would be a great candidate to share those resources that helped her navigate, like as far as, making sure you have the trust set up, and then, you have to have a certain amount of money to maybe qualify for certain services. So what does that look like? How can you take advantage of the services if you do have a pension that overqualifies you? So there's a lot of things that my mom learned and navigated that I know was very tricky, as far as finding the resources that he qualified for. Maybe, under the state that we were currently in that time. I'm not too familiar with some of the programs that Idaho has. I know California had some. And so, there are resources available, but I think that they're not utilized because people don't really know about them or how to navigate to use them. So again, I think that it's really important that people just understand the planning part of this so that they can just live in the moment and experience and cherish every moment they have with their loved ones versus worrying about the financial stress, when you can just set yourself up now when you have the time and you can make really great, wise decisions with a clear mind, to set yourself up for if there is something that comes about, an injury, an unexpected injury, illness. And, the thing that a lot of us don't think of is that our parents are going to age. All of us are going to age. So if we could help, our next generation, our kids, or by setting up the proper resources and trusts and stuff like that to be able to allow them to take care of us in the way that we want to, I think would just be of great value for sure.
Wendy, that's awesome. That's awesome advice. I mean, thank you for sharing the advice, everything you've gone through, a very personal story. If your mom would love to come on at some point and talk about some of the things she did and the resources, we would love to have her on the podcast. So again, I thank you. I want to thank our listeners out there. Folks, as we've talked about on each episode, if you have stories to tell, whether it's a personal story like Wendy, or you're a professional in the elder care industry and it's about clients or patients, please reach out to me. I'm about to give you an email where you can do that. Do you have a pen? Here's the email: eldered2023 at gmail.com. ELDERED 2023 at gmail.com. So, Wendy, I thank you again for coming on. And as we always do when we sign off, folks, have yourself an awesome day until we talk again. Bye-bye. Good morning. My name is Richard Wexler, and this is Caring in America, What's Coming Up. So we've had a conversation with Cindy Cook. She owns a placement company in Denver, Colorado called Aging at 5280. So let me ask you a question. Is caring giving back? Why is it important to really connect the dots and really understand this broader topic of aging, not only in Colorado, but around the United States? And can you truly bring a family together by bringing them together to support an aging loved one? And can families fall apart without that bringing together and talking and putting a plan together? Do we really connect the dots in healthcare? And is that important to do? What I mean by that, are doctors really connecting the dots for their patients? What are these dots? There is a lot of them. All the different things that that individual patient, aging loved one will need. And also the family. I have a question. Should we be offering a class? Let's call it Elder Ed. Should we be offering a navigator to people when they hit 65 years of age? What would that mean? How would it be helpful? We're going to talk, and we have talked about all these subjects. Please listen in. I think you'll really learn a lot. Secondly, we had a conversation with Mary Martinez. For the last 23 plus years, she's owned a home care franchise with Home Instead in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This was started with the thought process that who's there if family members aren't? If kids don't live close to an aging mom and dad, in-laws, grandparents, whomever it may be, what might those folks need to get through the day? The simple concept of home care. And we've talked about living in a community, living at home with home care. It's different for everyone. Some people are going to do better in a community. Some people are going to do better at home. One of the biggest factors we've talked about is cost. In this conversation with Mary, learning a lot more about the inner workings of a home care company. What do they do? What can't they do? What do they do with medication, shots, things like that? Can they help an aging loved one with simple, everyday things? Can they be there for the much more complex, like hospice care? I think you'll find it a very interesting conversation as we talk to Mary and her couple years of experience in this business being over 23. So we encourage you to listen to those episodes. And until we talk again, have yourself an awesome day.